made it through the Middle Passage. 388,000 directly to North America, and so forth. Now, this is in, the source of this information is in Bound for America by Roger Eckrich. Some scholars estimate that another 60 to 70,000 Africans ended up in the United States after touching down in the Caribbean first, so that would bring the total a little higher to 450,000 Africans. And this is a chart of slaves from this Dictionary of American Slavery, which is another tome in this field, shows you the numbers that were imported by year. And I have a sample of a 50, I did it in 50-year increments, going to mainland North America, British Caribbean, French Caribbean, Danish West Indies, Dutch Americas. So you can separate these numbers and parse them any way you choose. Okie dokie. Now, length of terms. Terms were determined by the cost of passage, upkeep costs, and skills. So if you were an indenture and you came to the New World because you wanted to seek your fortune in the new land, well, it kind of would depend. Your term in service would depend on what you were good at and how much in need that was. We've had people say, oh, our indenture was 4 years. Understand, there is no set time, all right? You got to find, if you're going to form a persona and decide that you're an indentured servant, what did your person do would kind of determine how long it would take for you to work off your debt. So the terms range from 3 to 14 years depending on the circumstances, and children would be kept until their age of majority of 18 or 21. Now, in my readings, you'll probably notice that the following is somewhat familiar. A fellow named Thomas Morley wrote about his adventure, about his trip across the Atlantic and what he experienced, what happened to him, and so forth. And he was the one who was given 3 biscuits a day, and each mess of 5 men given 3 pints of water. But in the Boston Evening Post, it advertised that if you were going on a ship, that you would be given all of this wonderful food, which by the time you actually got to the ship, kind of disappeared to thin air, or stayed in the upper decks, one or the other. But as you see, children 10 years or younger were counted as a half. All right.
Why did Boston Post?
To get people to want people to come.
Was it circulation in Boston?
Well, you see, here's the thing. When you were landed gentry, when the colony here in Maryland first started, the first bunch of guys that were, quote, investors, the 17 investors on the ship, they were called landed gentry because they received land, a grant of land. Well, the more people you brought in to settle the country, the more land you got. And then when those people, as indentures, worked off their indentures, they got a piece of it, a small piece of what you got. Eventually, the 100 years of, or the 100 acres of land got switched to 50 years because land is now, you know, you're getting out in the woods, right? So land is more,
50 acres.
Yes, it went to 50 acres. Yeah, I said 50 years now. 50 acres. And depending on the era, again, you've got to read the fine print on a lot of historical facts clearly because of laws that were made to change what was given as a custom at the end of an indenture. Eventually, land was taken away and they were given what they call the custom of the country. Maybe they'd give you some money. Maybe they'd just give you some clothes or a bushel of corn. There's so many variations that it was impossible for me to list them all. All I can tell you is the more you read, sometimes the more dangerous it gets because there's a lot of facts rolling around in there. Okay, let's look at the age of indentured servant. Now I'm sure you know the difference between the mean age and the average age range was from 5 years, the youngest recorded in this study that was done by Galenson. The youngest person was 5 years old, the oldest person was 69 years old. So when Scotty told me that at 64 I would be too old, or 65 when I wrote this thing, that I'd be too old for an indentured servant, so she made me 21. Well, I could have been that age. Might not have been any good, you know, and somebody had to feel sorry for me to hire me, right? But the average age would have been 32, but we have the mean age 18 to 24, nice and strong. There were significantly more men than women immigrated as indentured servants, and in Galenson's studies, when he parsed it out, he came to 90% men and 8% women. Could they read or write? Well, more men, signed their names to contracts than put an X. You can see that it's sort of the reverse, but actually more women were less educated, less able to sign their name. Let's look at the work that men were doing. Now, you're going to see the same names as many of the trades and craftspeople that Jean talked about. She just beat me to it, okay? She was scheduled earlier. But we have, I have listed, and I'm not going to read them all to you because there's just too much, but I'll read you the fields. They were in agriculture, they were in food and drink, they were in metal and wood, and these are all the jobs that they could do. They were in building and construction, clothing and textiles, and they were in the services. So there's like a ton of things that men were listed as occupations on their indenture contract. It was recorded in the records before they left. Women,
What was the husband?
farmer.
Couldn't hear it.
Mail order brides didn't start with cowboys. That's not a new concept. That was one of the reasons that women came to the colonies. They were also, because the registrations did not indicate their occupations, basically this is all we have listed for them. Now let's talk about, Can we go to one before this?
Want to go back one?
Okay.
Thank you.
Maybe I got it mixed up here. Just go ahead. Well, I had a slide here. I think I've got them out of order there. Compensation values. Ships' captains negotiated prices for transporting and feeding. They figured, what's it going to cost me as a captain to bring all these people across the ocean? And then they kept a lot of profit for themselves and fed people biscuits, ship's bread. Trips could be as short as 4 weeks or as long as 5 months, depending on the weather and the method in which they used. Next slide. There we go, living conditions. While you're reading this, let me tell you, each indentured servant would have their fare across the Atlantic paid in full by their master. A contract was written that stipulated the length of service. The servant would be supplied room and board while working in the master's fields. Upon completion of the contract, the servant would receive freedom dues, which was a prearranged termination bonus. This could include land, money, a gun, clothes, or food. On the surface, it seemed like a terrific way for the luckless English poor to make their way to prosperity in a new land. Beneath the surface, this was not often the case. Only about 40% of indentured servants lived to complete the terms of their contracts. Female servants were often subject of harassment or harassment from their masters. Unfortunately, A woman who became pregnant while a servant often had years tacked on to the end of her service time. Doesn't seem quite fair. Now, in Maryland, there were laws that stood up for the indentured servant. The indentured servant, in some cases, in the books that I've read, they documented some of these, they actually took their masters to court, and in some cases actually won their freedom, as a matter of fact. Early in the century, some servants were able to gain their own land as free men, but by 1660, that's what I was saying about land, much of the best land was claimed by large landowners. The former servants were pushed westward where the mountainous land was less arable and the threat from Indians constant. So an angry class of impoverished pioneer farmers began to emerge as the 1600s grew old. After Bacon's rebellion in 1676, planters began to prefer permanent slavery to the headright system that previously enabled them to prosper. So rather than mess around with indentured servants, they just blew that aside, and that's when slavery started to grow. It didn't stop indentured servants, but it started to grow. So what was a headright? It's your reward for doing your job. In Virginia, and this is where we talk about the acres of land. Cecil Calvert's father-in-law, Lord, how do I say this? Arundel, wrote in a letter to Winbanks, the Secretary of the Treasury, my son Baltimore is brought so low with the setting forward the plantations of Maryland and the clamorous suits and oppositions which he hath met with all in the business, as I do not see how he could subsist if I did not give him his diet for himself, his wife, his children, and his servants. So Cecil Calvert's father-in-law kept them in clothes and food, basically, because of all the lawsuits of people trying to sue the proprietor. Thank you. Sue the proprietor. The Maryland Act of 1639 provided that every servant at the completion of his or her indenture received the following: 3 barrels of corn, a hilling hoe, a weeding hoe, a felling axe, and to a manservant 1 new cloth suit, 1 new shirt, 1 pair of new shoes, 1 pair of new stockings, and a new Monmouth cap. And to a maidservant 1 new petticoat and waistcoat, 1 new smock, 1 pair of new shoes, 1 pair of new stockings, and the clothes formerly belonging to the servant, so she could keep the clothes that she had. Now, let's look at some famous indentures.
What's seasoning?
Seasoning is a condition that took place within the first 2 years of someone landing in this country. Seasoning, we talked about it, gosh, in a couple of our sessions already. It had to do with going through the different seasons that were here compared to England, but it also had to do, I always thought of seasoning as, like I said, new food, new climate, making it through in a new land with different bugs, there's different germs here, and different illnesses. It's living through your first 2 years. They were considered seasoned inhabitants.
Carolyn and I attended a lecture where a woman talked about the further south you went, the shorter your lifespan. The average lifespan from here south was like 48. You go to New England, Massachusetts, it was 72. And it was mosquitoes. You think of the swamps and the things we have around.
Right.
It was,
And their country, the people's country of origin was all in cold countries.
It's the food.
yeah.
So going someplace quite south like that was.
It's the food. It's eating grits.
In addition, it's in the grits.
Grits will kill you.
Yeah.
Grits will kill you.
Now, one famous indenture, Mateo de Souza, an indentured servant. He was the only black person to serve in the colonial Maryland legislature. He came here as indentured to Father Andrew White on the first ship. As such, he is the first African American to sit in any legislative body in what would become the United States, and that happened here in the Maryland colony. He was one of 9 indentured servants working for Father Andrew White, a Catholic priest, arrived at St. Mary's City. Well, you know all of that. They figure that he was of mixed origin, that he might have been African and possibly Portuguese. And after, when he worked here in Maryland, the Sousa worked for the Jesuit priests, but they don't know exactly, you know, he was just like their everything man. Their undertaker, because he undertook any job that they gave him. Generally, let's see, in 1638, having worked the required 4 years as an indentured servant, de Sousa became a free man. He earned money by continuing to work for the priests, but he also traded English goods with Indians for animal furs and food. And in 1641, he commanded a small boat on a 2-month voyage to trade with the Susquehanna Indians. In 1642, he sailed as a master of a ketch belonging to the provincial secretary, John Luber. So, he was a success. Another famous indenture was Robert Pega. William Pega,